Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Awesome. So it's not too bad of weather here. I got off the plane yesterday and I didn't freeze. I live in Florida, so all of this is a little disturbing for me. And I am freezing in this hotel. How many of you are staying in the hotel? Anyway, how many of you, hey Brady, how are you doing? It's good to see you. So how many of you does your heating and air conditioning have like on and off? I have mine down to 65, my room is 80. If I turn it up to 90, my room is 80. So I just turn the thing on and off. So anyway, okay. Well, listen. Thank you for coming. I want to ask you who you are. We're going to move kind of quickly because we only have an hour and a half. This is one of 3 sessions I'm doing, and I'm glad we're starting off with this one. I'm doing this one on Tier 1. I'm also doing one on focusing on the 4 conditions that accelerate the performance of kids with disabilities. I have spent the last almost 30 years in Florida where we've been doing a lot of work around MTSS and UDL and all of this type of stuff. And we have been very lucky and successful. Our kids with disabilities in Florida are the only state where they've actually closed the gap between kids with disabilities and kids without. And our 4-year graduation rates are between kids with disabilities and kids without, and we don't have any special diplomas. You got to do proficiency in high school. There's only a 4-point difference between our graduation rates, 4-year on-time graduation rates. And it's been a long haul. We've gone slow to go fast, but these 3 sessions are designed to focus on the 3 big ideas we've been doing for about 10 or 12 years, and our biggest focus has been on Tier 1. It has not been on special ed. It's not been on Tier 2 or Tier 3. We spent probably 7 or 8 years focusing on Tier 1. So we're going to talk about some of that today. I am probably going to disturb you a little bit by things I'm going to say and ask you to think about. So prepare to be disturbed. If solutions to that would be therapy, Adam can help you out with that, or medication, or the bar opens at 4:30. Whatever you want to do. So how many of you here are general education teachers? Awesome. How many of you are special education teachers? Guys, they're all sitting in the back. Is there some Indiana rule here or something? I don't know. What about student services like school psychologists? 1? Awesome. Good for you. Speech therapists, speech clinicians, speech and language, that whatever you are. Okay, bless you. PT, OT. Instructional coaches, literacy, behavior specialists, principals. Thank you very much for coming. Other administrators. Oh, thank you. Other duties as assigned. All of you, come on. All of you should be putting up your hands. Exactly. How many of you do one job? Only one job in school. Okay, so the goals today are to basically understand how we can use instruction in Tier 1 that is evidence-based for kids with disabilities and evidence-based for all kids, so that when students with disabilities, English learners, and others are in your general education classroom, the instruction that you're using will accelerate their growth at the same rate that it accelerates the growth of typical kids. There will still be a gap, but that's the focus of our session today. So the goals that are up here basically reflect that. The last one, entertain courageous conversations and enjoy your time. We're going to have 4 or 5, maybe 6 tabletops where I'm really going to ask you to have some good conversations about some of the ideas that we're talking about. Professional learning goals for this session. You know that in professional development there are 4 things that you focus on: knowledge, skills, dispositions, and practices. But for sessions like this, that's only an hour and a half, our goals are going to be knowledge and dispositions. We're not going to have time to practice and do that type of stuff, and we're not going to have time to work on developing individual skills. So your own background knowledge is going to inform a lot about what you take away from this session. I would love to also do skills and practices, but it's not realistic. So if you'll kind of focus on your conversations around knowledge And what's really going to be important here, and you know what drives all of this stuff about special ed, is people's attitudes and beliefs about kids with disabilities, and beliefs about what other people should be doing. We'll talk a little bit about shifts in beliefs and things that are barriers to shifts in beliefs as we go along. So in your tabletop discussions, kind of those focuses on skills and practices. Okay, I'm going to ask you 6 questions. And I'm going to ask you to either say they're true or false, or you agree or disagree with each of these 6 questions. And I will give you maybe 10 seconds to either write down an answer or get the answer in your head. Are you ready? And there's no right or wrong answers here. There's no score, so you're not going to get graded. They're really beliefs. Instruction that is evidence-based for kids with disabilities delivered by general education teacher in Tier 1 is specially designed instruction. Agree or disagree? To yourself. So put your hands up if you agree. Let's see. If you disagree, put your hands up. Obviously, the rest of you don't care. So the takeaway here is that specially designed instruction is not defined by who teaches it or where it is taught. Specially designed instruction is instruction that is designed to reduce or eliminate barriers to learning for kids with disabilities. And we're going to look at lots of it in this session. All of it, strangely enough, is instructional approaches that were evidence-based for typical learners initially, but then applied to groups of kids with disabilities, ELs, with and without disabilities, math, reading, etc. And lo and behold, certain of these typical kid instructional strategies are rocket ships for kids with disabilities. So the issue is, and in our state, if a general education teacher knows how to deliver this instruction, which she or he should, since it's typical kid instruction, 90 minutes of ELA at the elementary level goes on the IEP for specially designed instruction. It's not who delivers it or where. It is that it's evidence-based for kids with disabilities, whether they're in your class or not, or whether you're the teacher or there's a special ed teacher. Okay, the second question. Many instructional strategies that are evidence-based for students with disabilities have a greater impact on the rate of growth for students with disabilities when delivered in Tier 1 compared to when delivered in something like resource. In other words, if a special ed teacher is working with a small group in pullout, or it's being delivered in Tier 1, the growth rate for some of this stuff is actually higher when delivered in the special ed and the general ed classroom. And I want to thank all of you for coming, but in particular I want to thank the 3, 4, 5 building principals who are here. Part of my background is I was a building principal for 10 or 12 years. I was also a district administrator. My training started in school psychology in Indiana. I actually got my doctoral degree at Ball State. It happens to be in neuropsych, school psych, but nonetheless. And I was the first editor, this is how old I am. I was the first editor of the IASP newsletter way back in the day. So I have strong roots with Indiana. I love this place. I love it primarily between May and November. I love it more. I love it less between November and now. Okay, so the answer to that is yes. I'm going to show you which ones and how that works. The curriculum for students with disabilities is the curriculum that is based upon the state's academic content standards for the grade in which the child is enrolled. That's U.S. Department of Education guidelines. So how many of you agree with that? Just because it's the U.S. DOE telling you stuff, right? When was the last time the government told you something and you went, okay, I'll do that? How many of you agree with that? Disagree? It's hard. In my state and many others, how many of you have electronic IEP systems? Sure. You can, if you have a 5th grade kid, you cannot the drop-down menu will not give you anything below 5th grade. Fluency does not appear in any state standard beyond 3rd grade. So when we look at IEPs for 6th grade kids and the focus is on fluency, words correct per minute or what have you, and you're at the 2nd grade level, you couldn't put that on an IEP in most places because it's out of whack, right? Even though it's really important. IEPs must be aligned with the core content standards for the grade in which the kid is enrolled. Agree or disagree? That's the thing in Indiana too. So it doesn't, once again, it's not what is, it's what you agree or disagree with. The performance and proficiency of students in core instruction is the best predictor of success for struggling students, including those with disabilities. So I do a lot of work. I did some of the work with Brady and others initially here, and your state superintendent, around TSI schools, TSI, CSI. How do you approach those? What do you do with it? I work with the state of California. I was there for a week and a half last week working with their state department, doing tours and talking to superintendents and all of this kind of stuff, particularly for the ones who were being focused for TSI or CSI schools. And the fact is if you really want to move kids with disabilities, improve core instruction first. You cannot intervene your way out of bad core instruction. And bad, that's a pejorative term. I'm going to say ineffective. In all my years of being a building principal in a large school, in addition to all the other kids in the school, we had 110 kids with severe behavior and learning issues. In all my years as a building principal, I only had an issue with 3 teachers. And the issue I had with those teachers was not that they were bad teachers or ineffective teachers. They just were not effective with the population we had. And when they moved schools, they became awesome in terms of their impact. So ineffective instruction is not about bad teachers. Ineffective instruction is a knowledge gap between the instructional strategies I know and the ones that are needed. So ineffective instruction, professional learning, coaching, job embedded, technical assistance, that's the way to improve instruction. You don't go looking at replacing teachers. That's generally not an effective strategy. And I have data from Indiana to show this to you, and I have data from elsewhere I'll show it to you. It is critical that the scope, sequence, and pacing of specially designed instruction be aligned with the scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction in Tier 1. The reality is all of our kids with disabilities take the same assessments, except if they have alternate assessments, and that's a very small percentage of them. Those assessments are aligned with state standards and with the scope, sequence, and pacing of those state standards. So a lot of our kids with disabilities perform very poorly, not because they haven't learned something, but that what they haven't learned is the stuff that's being assessed. And I was doing something last night, reviewing for a school district, reviewing their MTSS system, okay? That's the easiest way to say it. And in their special ed part of it, they said that they assessed the effectiveness of special ed by measuring how many IEP goals students had attained proficiency on. I think that's a great idea, as long as your IEP goals are aligned with the grade level for which the kid is enrolled. If you have a 5th grade kid working at 2nd grade fluency and everybody's happy because the kid met a 2nd grade proficiency, that's not going to predict outcomes for kids very well. So important to note. Okay, those six things are things we're going to talk about here and provide evidence for and give you a chance to talk about it. I always start everything I do with this quote. So if you've seen me before, you've seen this quote. We can, whenever we choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We already know more than we need to know to do that. Whether or not we do it must finally depend on how we feel about the fact we haven't so far. So Indiana is no different than a lot of other states. I'm going to show you data shortly that even when you changed assessments, and you did that a few years back, 2015, something like that, where were you around? Although some of you look very young, some of you do not. So you were probably, here in 2015. When everybody's scores dropped when you switch the assessments. So I ran some data because I'd done some stuff for IPS. And through all the different assessments, over time, regardless of whether they were high or low, the gap between the performance of general ed kids and the performance of kids with disabilities in Indiana as a state has not changed. It approaches 40% different, 40% different, and it doesn't matter what test that's given. You can say, oh, all of our scores dropped. Absolutely, the gap is still the same. We have to close the gap. So we can't look and blame assessments on that. And the most legitimate and effective school improvement effort is not to design a system of interventions to help students at risk, but to upgrade the core curriculum. So that's what this session is about. And remember, this graphic is the U.S. Department of Education's graphic regarding how special ed fits into a multi-tiered system of supports. How many of you are familiar with MTSS? And if you're familiar with it, how many of you know how to spell it? Okay? MTSS is ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, is full of MTSS. All it is a framework for how to deliver instruction and supports. What do all kids get? What do some kids get? What do few kids get? That's the essence of it. We can't be effective if we have more kids that need intensive help than we have staff and resources to give them. So that triangle matters, and what the U.S. Department of Education has put out as where does special education fit, it's embedded in all of the tiers. It's not separate. It's not a place kids go when nothing else works. So this embeddedness is saying specially designed instruction has got to be embedded into whatever tier system. How many of you have kids you work with, either general ed, special ed, who are getting special ed services and title? Anybody? Yeah, sure. So how is, if you're getting title, then is that instruction being delivered in Title I? Is that evidence-based for kids with disabilities or not? If not, we wonder why we've got kids in a place where the instruction is not evidence-based to move them. So that embeddedness has got to be addressed. The most recent guidance on this, and this is just stuff that came out of a few years ago from the U.S. Department of Ed. There's a long letter that requires all this stuff, but here is what it basically says. These things, and we've already talked about it. And it's because these things are known to move kids. Shared responsibility, IEPs have to be aligned with state grade level standards. The belief that kids with disabilities, in the case of this conference, can in fact acquire grade level skills. And they can in fact do that. It's not easy. Low expectations, so reducing text density, utilizing simple text to teach comprehension, cutting down assignments. All of those things are associated with poor performance of kids with disabilities. If a kid can't read complex text and you're working on comprehension, then eliminate the reading component and use text to speech. How many of you know that, how many of you work with kids with disabilities, general ed or special ed? How many of you inherently know that these kids use words and understand them at a far higher level than they can actually read them? They use them in their speech every day. One of the things that I do with middle school and high school students is I will ask them to read a passage, ask them about a topic, and not reading it, ask them about a topic, their favorite topic, motorcycles, I don't know what, history, trial, who cares. And I ask them just to tell me about it. And I write down on a piece of paper all of the big words that they used in communicating to me. And when they're done, I turn it around and I ask them if they will please read those words. And they cannot. But they absolutely know what they mean, and their comprehension is just fine. In fact, we don't have a lot of kids percentage-wise, that have pure comprehension difficulties. We have kids that the combination of fluency and vocabulary, which are the two comprehension builders, there are barriers there, either background knowledge or the fluency does not allow them to have equity and access to content. So these kids can learn. And UDL is the bridge that we use to ensure equity and access. One of the sessions I'm going to do tomorrow is on integrated lesson planning and how we use the 3 principles of UDL to guide our lesson planning for both general ed and special ed. And the first principle of UDL around that is multiple ways of representing the instruction in the lesson planning. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Big idea is to stimulate your thinking today. The purpose of inclusion is to promote equity and access. That's it, along with the social emotional aspects of it. Equity and access to content. So the question is, are we doing that? I prefer to call UDL Universal Design for Instruction. And in my state, we have changed the term for Tier 1 instruction from general education to universal instruction. It is expected for diverse groups that our instruction is going to be more universal than general. And so we'll talk about what that looks like. And we already talked about that last thing. The planning stuff, we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so what's driving this movement? Basically the poor and flat proficiency rates of kids with disabilities, the lack of attention to powerful research that provides structures and strategies for Tier 1, the lack of focus on instruction and IEPs. It's maddening to me. I've been working in education since before we even had a special ed law. And the IEPs today don't look much different than they did in 1975, except that everybody knows how to stay out of jail, out of IEP jail. And we know how to do that because we have electronic IEPs that don't allow us to do bad things to where we have to wear stripes. I was a hearing officer in Indiana and Illinois for many years. And it got to the point where all of the legal stuff, people became so tense about the legal stuff. Everything, we have IEP facilitators to be sure we don't put bad things down on IEP and commit the district to something, blah, 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 blah. Look at your IEP and look how much of that IEP is instructional strategies. Go to your last problem-solving meeting, SST, whatever you call it. Take a stopwatch. And if you have an eye, you can do it very easily now. And if it's a 30-minute meeting, I want you to start and stop your watch every time actual instructional strategies are discussed. And at the end of the 30 minutes, look at your watch and do a percent. We did a research study in our state and found out that less than 10% of those kinds of meetings actually talk about instruction. And the only thing that enables kids with disabilities to improve is highly effective instruction, not meetings, not IEPs. Another study came out recently to look at the relationship between appropriate IEPs and student growth, and inappropriate IEPs and student growth. There was no difference. IEPs do not influence student growth. And they don't because they don't have instruction in them. They have goals. And it's instruction that what changes kids, not goals. So it's all kind of logical. So we have to find a place to start landing this instruction stuff. So I'm going to ask you to do something here and talk about this for a few minutes. This is going to be our first tabletop. There it is. So how do we engage our general education partners in understanding some of the concepts we've just talked about? But two big ones. Number one, the performance of kids in general education predicts the growth rate for special ed kids. And that the scope, sequence, and pacing of that instruction has to be reflected in the tiers, and what the tiers are doing has to be reflected in Tier 1. So general education teachers, those of you who are in here, you know that you're overwhelmed. You don't need another thing to do. None of us in education need that. But how can you work smarter? I have a real issue with differentiated instruction. I don't know after all of my years in education what the heck it means. Is it on the fly? You know, if you have 8 kids you have to differentiate for, seriously, and you have a 60-minute math lesson, how are you going to do that? Academic engaged time predicts growth better than anything else. We're going to talk about that multiple times today. I don't know how differentiation works. I just know that when people work with an individual kid and try to do it a different way, we call it differentiation. But if it's not systematic, it's one-offs, the kid is like, okay, they get over the hump that you help them with, but there's no strategy for the kid to use it and apply it. So we can work smarter. General ed teachers can be less anxious about this if they know that the instruction they're using can also be engaged by diverse people in the classroom, rather than running around trying to do stuff and then hopscotching to help the kids who are struggling. So it's actually less work. So students with disabilities generally have the lowest performance levels of any demographic group. For the first time since we started No Child Left Behind and AYP, and then we evolved to ESSA, and we had schools in need of improvement. There were SIN schools in our state, schools in need of improvement, right? If you don't want a religious context. And then we moved to TSI, CSI. For the first time, including here in Indiana, you have more of your TSI schools that are TSI because of the performance of kids with disabilities than any other category. When we first started this, it was only 14% of schools that were in TSI hell, or whatever you want to call it, were due to kids with disabilities. Now it's the majority of them. So every building principal, every superintendent should be very interested in improving the outcomes of students with disabilities, if for no other reason to get out of TSI hell. So we have a perfect opportunity to engage our general education friends and colleagues in this effort. So all of these things here, you can read them. Students with disabilities are held to the same standards. State level assessments, we've already talked about that. So I'm going to ask you to have a discussion. What barriers do you believe exist in your school or in your district that would make this integrated, seamless, collaborative process difficult? How do we engage general education teachers in thinking that if there is instruction that I can use and that will impact diverse kids, how come I'm not using it? What are the barriers to this? So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to talk about that, and then I'm going to ask for some of your thoughts. And you can think about your school, or you can think about your district. Is the question clear? Okay, 5 minutes, and I'll give you a 1 minute warning. Go.
I have lots of, so it's the same day every week.
Wow. You may be the best group I've ever had that stops talking. We'll see how that goes for the rest of the session. You're just warming up. Thank you. So share a couple of your thoughts that reflect the discussion at your table. And please speak up, because the gentleman who is doing, well, I don't know if he's a gentleman or not, but the guy over here who's doing the videoing, he does have a microphone in that area. So share. Put your hand there. Thank you. Oh, and since you're close, this will make your life easier. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm in a small school, and I'm a special education teacher. I'm working with 6 different grade levels, 12 different classrooms of students in those classrooms, and the range of their ability level is from an IQ of 41 or so up to those kiddos that just need a little bit more help with comprehension. And so it's really difficult to really be able to get to all of their needs. And I just, right now I'm pulling according to their ability level with, reading. But, some students, I just moved into this school a couple years ago, and they're in elementary school, but already 5 years behind.
Sure.
Yeah. And fourth graders that are not speaking in complete sentences, but we don't have a self-contained room for those students. And
so it's you.
Yeah.
It's you. Yes. Small schools, not to make your life seem like you're in a big school, but I was in a school district in California last week, 27 schools in the district, and 5 of the schools, K through 8, had a total of 5 students in the school. So the principal was also the bus driver, was also the special ed teacher, the 504 coordinator, the Title I coordinator. all of that kind of stuff. So that clearly presents a challenge. So our main goal for all of your students is getting them equity and access to content. Many of your students, their disability is what is denying that access. So we have to figure alternative strategies to get, and some of the stuff we talk about hopefully will be helpful. But it clearly is a challenge. And I know that's above your pay grade, but it's very difficult for somebody to do the job you're doing and have equal impact across all of those students. It's tough. It is very tough. So maybe some of the stuff we talk about today will give you food for thought. What we don't want to do, what is not going to be helpful, is you only have 330 minutes in your day. And if you have all of those kids and you divide it up, think about if you're having to individualize for each of them how many actual minutes of instruction they're getting. It's not enough.
Right, with 30,
Right.
30 plus kids.
Exactly. So you got 10 minutes apiece.
Yeah.
11 minutes apiece, if you have to individualize them. So we have to think above that level and say, what can we do that would affect all of them, so that when we do individualize, they're not completely dependent upon that. Awesome. Another sharing that you discussed at your table. Yes, you're close, so look at him and speak up.
Okay. So one of the things that we talked about, that I brought up, was that a lot of times when we talk about Tier 1 instruction and with special education students in the general education class, what I hear from the general education teachers is, but I'm not a special education teacher, so I don't know how to reach
Yep.
those students.
Right. Did you hear the comment that general ed teachers are saying, I'm not a special ed teacher, and therefore I don't know how to reach those students? And that is a legitimate concern. You don't want to feel as if what you're doing is not helpful when you think there's somebody else who can do it and make it work. So that's also false. There's no way that a special ed teacher, the average time, take kids with learning disabilities, even when it's done well, the average amount of time in the United States that a teacher spends with kids with learning disabilities, a special ed teacher, is 42 minutes, while the other kids are getting 90 minutes of ELA. Academic and engaged time predicts growth. So we have to find a way to collaborate so that that 90 minutes is added to the 42 minutes, and now these kids are getting much deeper level of instruction. And this is not the solution to it. Good instruction is good instruction first. So I wouldn't say, oh, of course you know how to teach kids with this, because that's a belief. This is a guiding principle for this person, how this person thinks. But the truth is, how many of you have been exposed to, either as students or colleagues, or you're one yourself? You're so good at instruction that all kids in that classroom benefit, regardless of whether they're kids with disabilities, can speak English or not. It's just a solid instructional environment. And outside of school, there is no such thing called specially designed instruction. There's no SDI lines at McDonald's. There's not like 3 drive-thrus and one says SDI on it. So the reality is that the more that we have instruction kids can do well with only when they get that instruction, in the long term it's not going to help them, because that isn't available everywhere else. So first, good instruction is good instruction. We're not asking general ed teachers to be the special ed teacher. We're asking them to pick instruction that contributes to the growth of these students while we're also contributing to the growth of them. We just need more time exposed to effective instruction. That's why the methods we're going to talk about today are typical instructional methods that researchers have validated for kids with disabilities. So as opposed to, what we don't want to have is teachers who, regardless of the cohort that comes through every year, do the same thing they've always done. Yes?
I think a lot of it is pace. Like, I think the instruction is good, and the kids are picking it, but it's the pace. Like, the kids can't keep up with the pace of instruction.
Exactly.
Because you've put them in a co-taught class, and you've got kids with a Lexile 300 with kids with a Lexile
Yep.
1500, and you're like, holy moly, macaroni.
So talk about the pacing of instruction. Absolutely. However, What mitigates a pacing problem is time. When we think about this, right? Your third grade standards, your fourth grade standards, are based upon the amount of progress a typical student can make with 90 minutes of ELA a day. Okay? So there's 56,700 minutes in a school year. Approximately 18,500 are targeted for literacy. If we up that to 25,000 minutes a year, then the standards would be different. Because with more time, kids will move more quickly. That's not a perfect relationship, but it's close. So for kids who are behind, that's why they need more time focusing on that skill. Part of it is to mitigate the pacing issue. If they have more time to practice, we'll talk about these other things as well, but one of the most effective strategies with struggling learners, regardless if you're a special ed teacher, title teacher, EL, doesn't matter, a mom, a dad, is pre-teaching. You don't want the first instruction on something to occur in Tier 1 for kids who struggle. They need the background knowledge. They already think they can't do it. If they have it pre-teaching, they will have confidence. They've heard it before. They have a way to connect to it. So one of the things we do with struggling kids, including kids with disabilities, is we're always trying to fix something they didn't learn. Reteach. Pre-teaching has a far greater impact on kids than reteaching. Reteaching, you have to undo what they already, the way they did it, and now teach them a different way. If you pre-teach it, then their general ed experience is the second exposure to it, not the first. So I'm not discounting anything that you're saying there, Rhonda. I totally believe what you've said. But there are things we can do to mitigate it in terms of how we use our time in instruction. Pre-teach is an example of an adult thing. And the other thing is, how can we get these kids more time of exposed to instruction? And we're going to talk about that. But I'm going to give you a advanced organizer for one of the sessions tomorrow in case you don't come. There should be one instructional plan for kids. The IEP should be the resource for the scope, sequence, and pacing of Tier 1, not something separate. So an example is if you're working on fluency, if you're working on vocabulary as IEP goals, do it from the text materials. If you have a fifth grade kid, you have first grade words, second grade words, all of that in a fifth grade social studies book. So if you're pre-teaching, you know what the lesson plan is, and you're pre-teaching and pulling words for vocabulary out of that Tier 1, now you've pre-taught things that the kid is going to use immediately. But the idea that we do words and to build these fluency skills that are not embedded in the actual materials that the kids are using in Tier 1, that's not a good use of our time. So there are a bunch of strategies that you can use to help the pacing issue. There's not going to solve it totally, but part of our issue with kids with disabilities included in Tier 1 is that they're physically included. They're not instructionally included, and the minute something starts being talked about for ELA or math, these kids are so used to not being able to do stuff, they simply turn it off. And that engagement is huge. Pre-teaching is the best strategy you can use for immediate engagement. The kid goes, I've done this. I've done this. And they now perk up. So we can't teach and engage kids totally all the time. We're going to move on, but this is a conversation you have to have if you're from the same school or district. All the systems can be in place, but unless students improve when they're exposed to this high quality instruction. So the purpose of Tier 1, and you can look at this by pulling up your stuff, I'm only going to hit a couple of highlights. Tier 1 sets the scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction for the entire building by grade level or subject area. And the content in Tier 1, now this is assuming it's done correctly, is aligned with what kids are expected to know, understand, and do in that grade level. So for special ed teachers, you can look at the pacing And you know, don't wait till kids get behind. Look at the pacing right at the beginning. You see the lesson plans. You see how fast teachers are moving. But a lot of that stuff for general ed kids is not only the essential elements of instruction, it's also enrichment. You have to focus on the essential elements. How many of you, what do you teach? Oh, you're a special ed teacher. Who's a general ed teacher in here? Put your hand up. What do you teach? What grade?
6th grade language arts.
6th grade language arts. You're a middle school teacher. You look pretty normal. Middle school teachers are usually as little wonky as the kids, but you look oh, there you go. Now she's a middle school teacher. I look normal, right? Who else is a general ed teacher? What do you teach?
3rd grade.
3rd grade. So for 3rd or 6th, it doesn't matter. Both of you should be interested hugely, and this is particularly true for special ed teachers, in what it is the 4th grade teacher expects those kids to know, understand, and do when it comes out of your class, Kelsey, and the 7th grade. And you, as a building principal, at the beginning of the year, I always had 3rd and 4th, 6th and 7th meet and say. So I would say, if I was a 2nd grade teacher, Kelsey, I would say, is it Kelsey? Oh, yeah, Kelsey, I would say, look, if I can't get some of my 2nd graders doing everything to be ready for 3rd grade, what are the most essential things if you could pick the skills that you want these kids to have when they come in, tell me what they are. Tell me. And then that, particularly with special ed teachers, should guide what you're thinking about. Don't look at that scope, sequence, and pacing in the book and think, oh my God, my kids will never be able to do this. What does the next year's teacher think are the critical skills to survive in ELA in 4th grade or in 7th grade? I was doing an all-day thing about instruction, and it was for middle and high school teachers. And I asked them that question. And the middle school teachers thought the high school teachers wanted kids to be able to do punctuation, all of that kind of stuff. The high school teacher said, forget it, I can teach kids punctuation. I can scaffold it for them. But unless the kids don't understand how to start, beginning, middle, and end of a product, if they don't have the comprehension, know how to chunk, know how to do all of that kind of stuff, don't focus for kids who are struggling on punctuation. It doesn't improve anything. I can work on that. Here's what I need from you. That was an epiphany. These middle school teachers were in the same district as the high school teachers. They thought if these kids didn't have capitalization and punctuation, the high school teacher would immediately think they're incompetent. And the high school teachers, I don't even look at it. It's not what I'm interested in. I can fix that. What I can't fix is this. Please focus on this. So think about that strategy, right? So then that will help you with some of the pacing things. So it sets the scope, sequence, and pacing. It's the broadest scope of the curriculum. It's the fewest assessments. Tier 1, it's for ELA, it's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. And your assessments, what do? You do some benchmarking for your kids 3 times a year. You look at your daily products, and you have an end of the year assessment of some kind if the state requires it. That's it. But now when we start drilling down tier 2, tier 3 special ed, all of that amps up. There's a huge expectation in general ed for kids to be engaged. We don't want Motel 6 kids. Lights on, nobody's home. And the higher up you get, the more teachers expect kids to bring something to that teaching and learning table. And it frustrates them when the kids don't. So engagement strategies are huge. The number one skill I want kids with disabilities beyond 3rd grade to have for engagement is to know how to ask questions. And we practice. So if Kelsey is stuck on doing something I'm working with her on as her special ed teacher, I'm going to take that moment to teach her how to raise her hand and ask the general education teacher a question specific to what she's stuck on. All of you know that when kids ask questions, it tells you instantly what they know and what they don't. and then you can respond to them based upon the question. If they don't ask you questions, you have to then look at it and say, well, do you know how to do this? Did you do that? You go through all of this. Engagement, asking questions is huge for struggling kids, because they have to think about what they don't know, put it in a question, and now they're engaged in this help process. So there are some expectations around engagement. Universal education, universal design, and general ed teachers lesson plan. They actually do. Special ed teachers, if you've not been a general ed teacher, you're not taught how to lesson plan. You're not even taught standards aligned stuff and doing scope, sequence, and pacing. You're taught to write IEPs and help deficits. So there's a huge culture difference here. And this is not to be negative about special ed teachers. It's the nature of our university training programs, which is awful for special ed, to be honest with you. As a building principal, I had 20 teachers in my building who were special ed certified because we had 110 kids who needed those services. I never hired, because of the unique setting, I never hired a teacher, a special ed teacher, who didn't have at least 2 or 3 years of general ed experience, because I needed them to know how to do standards aligned instructional planning. But it's not taught. So districts, principals, think about, don't put pressure on your special ed teachers to do scope, sequence, and pacing and standards alignment. Find out if they have the skills to do that. They weren't taught it as part of their education. And if you go to a lesson planning meeting, you don't want to go there and not knowing what happens and why we're doing a standard, a learning goal, blah, 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 blah. And there's a sequence of doing that. You don't want to have lack of background knowledge, or the discussion will focus on you and what should I do with this kid, okay? So what's special about special education? It's huge. Special education teachers are absolutely necessary. What is not necessary is that they're the kid's only teacher. That's a problem. So we'll talk more about that. So why is Tier 1 so important? Here's data from Indiana, and this is a few years old, but you can just look on the far right to see that the general ed, special ed gap over those 4 years simply did not close, and it hasn't done it since. So we're not making any progress there. But remember, those gaps are based upon assessments that are tied to grade level standards for kids. So part of it is the assessment. But the bigger part of us is us focusing too much on those deficits. So here's some data, and I have 4 slides here to show you. This is from 2 different school districts in Michigan, grade 4 and grade 8 in each case. And on the left-hand side is the rate of progress over time by general ed kids in that particular district. That's ELA. And on the right-hand side, it's the slope of the line of growth for kids with disabilities in that district. The slopes of the line match. Here's a case in 7th grade. The slope is slower growth, but look at kids with disabilities. The slopes match. Now, this is a district that has been going down the tubes. Kids with disabilities are going down the tubes. And in 7th grade in that district, things continue to get worse, and special ed kids are down at the bottom. So a strong relationship exists between the power of Tier 1 and the rate of progress for kids with disabilities, and it has to be fit into your equation. So I'm going to give you another tabletop here very quickly. Does a common language, common understanding exist that the performance of students with disabilities is strongly related to the performance of kids in Tier 1? Particularly those who are struggling learners. So those could be your kids on free and reduced lunch, they could be your ELs, they could be your frequent flyers, kids that move schools a lot and have discontinuity and they're not in any place long enough to get anything. So it could be any of those kids. It's how is Tier 1 effective with struggling learners who are not identified as kids with disabilities. So you look at those disaggregated groups. Sometimes there's a race ethnicity thing, but that's always a function of socioeconomic status. When you compare high-performing non-white kids, high socioeconomic non-white kids, with white kids, those rates tend to be very close. It's socioeconomic status that tends to be the big killer. So look at how you're doing with those kids. And that's going to predict how you're doing with kids with disabilities. So is there a common language, common understanding? What do you think would have to happen in your school or your district to get everybody in your building understanding this relationship between the power of Tier 1 and struggling kids? I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Go. So the bottom line here is that if general education teachers can look at struggling students as a category, as opposed to looking at kids who are poverty, language, disability, most instructional strategies that benefit struggling learners benefit kids with disabilities. In my first years as a school psychologist, which started, like I said, here in Indiana, I did my internship in Fort Wayne, and I had my first job at Northwest Indiana Special Ed Co-op. At the time, it was in Highland, Indiana, but now it's at Crown Point. It moved. And one of my immediate frustrations was, that was back in the day when you'd have individual kids referred and what have you, and the teachers would say things like, I don't have time to put that much energy into one kid. And I got it. And so I just started thinking logically, like, if a teacher can't put, I never knew if it was won't or can't, I didn't care, time into an individual kid. What if there were 6 or 7 kids like this kid? Would the teacher now put time into a group? So I lasted as a school psychologist for about 6 months before I started asking. At the first time I worked with teacher, you referred Kelsey. Is she the only one, or is she the worst? Are there other kids who are struggling with the same kinds of issues, but the principal would get upset with you if you referred 15 kids at one time? And every teacher always said, yes, I've got 4, 5, 6 others, but she's the worst. I said, then why don't we think about developing strategies, instructional strategies to do with all of these kids? All of a sudden now you have an engaged teacher. So the same thing is true when you're looking at ELs. Group these kids as struggling learners, and that you're not going to have to do something special for each one. And use technology, we'll see that in a minute, use technology to bridge the differences. Okay. So I'm not going to spend much time on this because I'm sensitive to our time. I'm a little behind. But if we have to have common language, common understanding of what lesson planning looks like, how we unpack standards. And the easiest way to start with that common language, common understanding is standards say they don't tell you what to teach. They tell you what kids have to know, understand, and do. And you know by unpacking standards that the verbs in a standard are the do, and the nouns in a standard are the know. So the first thing you do is underline the nouns and circle the verbs. And one is knowledge, and one is performance. That's the common language, common understanding. There's not a standard that says, for comprehension, that you actually have to read the words, and shocking, there's not a standard that says you have to write the performance. Those are things we as educators lay on to it. And remember, nobody can write at a level above their fluency, unless they have memorized how to spell every word. Otherwise, they do what I call license plate assignments. How many of you I live in a state where everybody has a vanity license plate, and some of them, it really takes longer than the light for me to figure out what the license plate, and then they're like, oh, I got it. So license plate is I do it, phonetically or something. So you have choices about how you give instruction to kids and how they perform it. And don't just think about the assessment at the end of the year, because that's not a good indicator for what should be driving the way we do things when that way is denying access for kids. The assessment thing is going to work itself out sooner rather than later. Trust me on that. So this common language, common understanding, the steps, standard, learning goals, engaging instruction. Special ed teachers, let's just say that you're just sitting in on a lesson planning meeting. And the gen ed teachers are going to go from here's the standard, here are the learning goals, and here's our engaging lesson. Now you have to ask the question, is this lesson engaging for my kids? And it's like, what? They're supposed to get into groups, read independently, silently, and then produce this written document that you're going to score with a rubric. The buzzer should be going off. No can read. No can write. Buzzer bad. Okay? And now you have to think, how can that instruction be modified and the performance parameters for my kids? And that's why you're there. Before. How many of you are general ed teachers again besides these two? How many of you have planned a lesson? How many of you consider yourself good at lesson planning? Put your hands up. Because if not, you're crazy. I mean, I don't mean you are crazy, you're driving yourself crazy. It's like going to a football game without having practiced. You don't know what the playbook is, right? How many of you kick yourself when you start teaching what you plan to do in your lesson plan and you look out there and there's 4 kids that are not engaged and you're like, dang, why didn't I remember this? Because it's really hard to fix it on the fly, isn't it? But if you had built those strategies in thinking about, it's okay that you develop a lesson that isn't engaging for all kids. Then just add stuff ahead of time for how am I going to accommodate for those kids. Don't wait till you're in the middle of a lesson and now you got a kid engaging in behavioral issues to get out of a failure situation and now you're dealing with referring a kid to the blah, 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 however you deal with it. Taking away from your instructional time. So and we'll talk tomorrow about different ways that special ed teachers can fit into this lesson planning process. But it's critical, but you've got to have a basic understanding of the lesson planning to begin with. There are 10 evidence-based strategies for teaching reading that have high levels of effectiveness. 3 of them, whoops, they're marked here, explicit, guided, and corrective. Notice I didn't say explicit, corrective, and guided. That would be reteaching. Explicit, guided, and corrective. They're highly effective with struggling kids. So we'll talk about some of that later. Academic engaged time is the best predictor of rate of growth, bar anything. And for your kids with an IQ of 41, it applies the same as for a kid with an IQ of 141. The more time you spend doing something, the better you get at it, regardless of your skill level. So that's why MTSS tiers are first differentiated by time. You can't have a kid in Tier 2 getting specialized instruction at the expense of Tier 1 time and think it will help. It won't. So Tier 2 is typically up to 50% more time than Tier 1 for that subject area. So 90 minutes ELA, Tier 2 is up to 135 minutes. The schedule has to accommodate that. In the session tomorrow, we'll look at schedules and what have you. Tier 3 is another 50%. All of our elementary schools in Florida have a schedule that allows up to 180 minutes a day, 90 plus 45 plus 45, to be dedicated to ELA. Up to that. The easiest way we do it is we roll social studies into ELA. Instead of reading ridiculous stuff, we do social studies. You got to read something. So we grab another 60 minutes a day right there. And we have a flex schedule so that that time can be used. Some of our kids only need 30 minutes of ELA a day, and they're on it. They're gone. Other kids need 180 minutes a day. So schedule has to help that. But academic engaged time, so when you think about if you have SLD kids and you think about they're included and they're included for 90 minutes, how much of that 90 minutes do you think is effective for them? Make it up. And then add what you're doing, and that's the amount of instructional time your kids are actually getting in ELA. And then compare that to typical kids. Academic engaged time predicts growth. Typical kids are getting 90 minutes. There's no way that 90 minutes is enough for our kids who struggle. It's simply not possible. And they will not accelerate. Okay, so basically that's what we're saying here. I'm going to merge this tabletop into the next one because I want to get into the strategies. So multi-tiered system of support, you understand that, but here's what a multi-tiered system in this integrated model sounds like. Tier 1, what does everybody do for all students? Okay. Tier 2, what does everybody do for students getting Tier 2 services? And Tier 3, what does everybody do for kids getting Tier 3 services? If the higher up you go, the fewer people are involved, that's a killer. For kids in getting Tier 3 services, there's got to be something going on in Tier 1 to link the stuff. It has to. And we have a model right now where the higher up you go, the more you're working with a special ed teacher or EL teacher, and the fewer people are involved in your instructional community. It absolutely will not work. So this integrated lesson planning thing helps us deal with that. Okay, for Tier 1, universal design for learning, there's the definition. How many of you are familiar with UDL? And you know how to spell it? I love acronyms because, yeah, I don't have to worry about spelling them as long as you know the correct letters. So here's basically the core of UDL. UDL is not computer stuff. UDL's home is in Tier 1. Its home is not in Tier 2, Tier 3, or special ed. 3 principles. This is about thinking. The 3 principles of developing instruction. What are the different ways I can present it? What are the different ways I can allow kids to demonstrate their knowledge? And how do I ensure that I keep kids engaged in this teaching, learning, demonstration process? So let's quickly take a look at how we implement those. This cartoon, I found it, I think it's funny. If you can't see it, there's a bird, a monkey, a penguin, an elephant, a fish, either a seal or a walrus, I don't know which, and I assume the thing at the end is a dog that mated with a donkey. It doesn't look like a donkey, it doesn't look like a dog, it looks like something in between. And state assessment. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Sound familiar? Please climb the tree. Now, who's got this with no difficulty whatsoever? Which one of those animals? Don't say the fish. Who's going to climb the tree easiest? Born to climb. The monkey. Who else could get up in the tree if the goal is to get up in the tree and not your climbing skills? The bird. Absolutely. So each of those could probably end up in the tree if that's the goal. Comprehension. If we're going to focus on the word climb, that would be equivalent to you have to be able to have the fluency to read it at your grade level. So what is the goal? Beyond 3rd grade, there's no fluency goals. They're all comprehension. So you do anything you have to get around the comprehension skill deficit to measure the fluency skill deficit to measure comprehension. Otherwise, you think you're measuring comprehension, you're really measuring fluency. Be asking like a blind person to read it. I understand that on the state exam, you have to be able to read it. So I want you to stare at this until you see enough of it to be able to read it. That's ridiculous. Remember, though, that learning disability, dyslexia's original term was word blindness. The brain can see it, but it's blind to its ability to decode it. So it's just 2 different forms of blindness. So that's what we're trying to get at. So we could select instructional strategies that are evidence-based for typical kids and then differentiate and get Tier 2 and Tier 3 help or send them to the special ed teacher. Or we could do this universal instruction. So let's, I'm going to save this tabletop till the end. Multiple presentation styles. Those are all ways to present stuff differently. Or we can do universal. So I'm going to go through and give you some examples of universal instruction in Tier 1 that's evidence-based for kids with disabilities, but then I'm going to end with giving you the strategy that all of these are based on. So it's called strategy-based instruction. This happens to be, and this would be for you, what's your first name?
Emily.
Emily. So this would be for Emily and her colleagues in middle school. So collaborative strategic reading is a strategy-based instruction that has high levels of student engagement because it has 6 steps to it, and it's student-driven. And kids are at center tables, and they're given the task, and they're given the steps, and the teacher guides them through the steps, but they do it at their table. And you organize kids at that table so that you have some kids that are a facilitator, some kids that are a note taker, other kids, and your kids with disabilities, EL kids, there's enough support at that table to be able to sit. So here are the outcomes that I want you to pay attention to. This growth rate at the top, the dark line, are typical kids. That's the rate at which they grew when getting on comprehension skills, when getting CSR. This dotted line next is the growth rate of students with disabilities who got it in the general education classroom. Notice those lines are parallel. Can you see that? Meaning the growth rate is the same. The gap hasn't closed, but general education is not there to close the gap. It's there to keep them progressing, and special ed and specially designed instruction outside of Tier 1 to close the gap. So if you're not having, if that kid is sitting in 90 minutes in elementary ed, you need to have that be some benefit to the kid. You can't be working with kids on IEPs and getting their skills improved while they're wasting 90 minutes of time over here. So that's why inclusion is not a place, it's not physical, it's exposed to inclusive instruction. And the bottom line is for kids with disabilities who get stuff not in Tier 1. They still make some growth, but not nearly as much as in Tier 1. Let's take another, this is high school. PACT, Promoting Adolescent Comprehension Through Text, is also strategy-based. In this study, it was Jeannie Wanzak and some of her colleagues. In the area of content acquisition, both English learners and non-English learners with disabilities were able to significantly benefit from PACT used in general education settings. But these are general ed principles. This happens to be some stuff for math. Enhanced anchored instruction is the strategy stuff for math, equivalent to the strategy stuff for ELA types of skills. And the takeaway here was that they all improved, but students with disabilities in inclusive settings scored higher. So when we talk about inclusion, and I'll give away something here for a session tomorrow that we're going to delve into. There are 4 conditions that, if present, students with disabilities will accelerate beyond levels they've ever done before. The first one is inclusion. The higher the levels of inclusion, the higher the rates of progress, but it can't be physical inclusion. It has to be instructional inclusion. The second one is standards-aligned IEPs, where people really do standards-aligned IEPs in terms of instruction. The third one is integrated lesson planning, so that everybody who works with these kids is on the same page. And the fourth one is having lesson planning driven by the 3 principles of universal design. Those 4 conditions, when they happen, your kids with disabilities will start moving fast. So we're drilling down into those tomorrow, but that's why that has been known for a while. So Sharon Vaughn, how many of you have heard of Sharon Vaughn? General education, she's like guru of reading in the country. She knows the logistical mess of trying to get general ed teachers to accommodate for kids with disabilities while they're dealing with everything else on that train. And so she said there's got to be typical instructional strategies for reading that also benefit kids with disabilities. So she started this research trend. And then Boardman, Wanzek, and others, lots of people started looking at typical across the grade levels, typical approaches to teaching ELA and math and said, these approaches should work better with kids with disabilities. These won't. And it was the strategy-based stuff. So that's where this research has come out of. And there's another one here for math. But once again, the reason I included this one is that the additional instructional time is what contributed in part to this strategy-based instruction. So let's take a look at, how many of you have heard of strategic instruction model, SIM? It's Don Deschler, University of Kansas. It's a typical instructional model, typical strategy-based instruction model. So this is an example from one of our schools in Florida, DeSoto Middle School. A critical component to SIM is content enhancement routines. And the strategy, the way you do those, kids with disabilities engage them and can do them. So this is looking at over a 3-year period of time, the growth rates for different groups of kids that occurred once SIM was put into place. So this was done for math, not ELA. So this is math achievement for all kids. This is math achievement for kids with disabilities. This is the math learning gains, and this is math for the lowest 25% of the kids, which is often kids of poverty and what have you. So over this 3-year period of time, the performance of kids with disabilities doubled. The performance of the bottom 25% of kids, look at what their growth rates were. In the second year, their learning gains were just about the level of all kids. And this was just a Tier 1 strategy. Now, these kids were also getting some other help, like the special ed kids. But these growth rates happened after Tier 1 decided to utilize SIM for all kids. So overall, this self-regulated strategy development is the concept that guides these instructional methods. So I've given you some steps here, and I want you to think about in your work with kids with disabilities. So self-regulated strategy development is an intervention approach designed to improve students' academic skills through a 6-step process that teaches students the specific academic strategies and self-regulation skills. The practice is especially appropriate for kids with learning disabilities, but was designed for all kids. So these are things, let's suppose that you're going to decide to do this type of thing. And let's suppose that you find a general education teacher. There's an Emily in your world, and she's like, I would really like to try this with all my kids. And you say, awesome, let's try it together. So you can look at the steps. They're pretty straightforward. Be sure that you have the background knowledge. If you don't have the background knowledge, it's really hard to do something, right? Discuss the strategy. This is how we're going to approach this. Model it. Have the kids memorize the strategy by practice. Kids with disabilities, if they've got problems with that, give them a strategy sheet. The steps. First I do this, then I do this, then I do this. When we do self-regulated strategy development, we put on the table in each of the groups, we put the steps. And you have a table facilitator. And the teacher has often scaffold. Here's what to do background knowledge. Here's blah, 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 blah. You can scaffold it. Support the strategy and then transfer it. So let's suppose that Emily is going to be doing that. And now you as the special ed teacher, you have 2, let's say 3 kids in our classroom. And you're going to start using pre-teaching. You can use the same 6 steps to pre-teach when Emily is going to use the same 6 steps in her classroom in 2 days. Is this making a little bit of sense? So we don't want to focus on just ways of instruction. We want to focus on strategies kids can use to acquire the skills on their own. That gets to the third principle of UDL. Strategy-based instruction is awfully engaging for kids. They love it because they don't got to sit and listen like you are right now. They're actually doing stuff. And they know, and it's the same 6 steps for everything. They use it in math, they use it in reading. It is a school-wide strategy approach to teaching that accommodates almost any kind of content area. So, and we only have about 6 minutes left here. I stuck this in not to go through it. This is an example for and applying it to collaborative strategic reading. So collaborative strategic reading has 6 steps, but what I'm saying is when you look at enhanced anchored instruction, SIM, collaborative, don't worry about what are the 6 steps for this, the 5 steps for that, the 4 steps. They all abide by the basic 6 steps, more or less, of self-regulated strategy development. So these things here are what's in the teacher guide for CSR, collaborative strategic reading. Background knowledge. Teacher leads a short preview of the text. Teacher states what the topic is. Teacher presents a few key vocabulary concepts. That's the group instruction. Students are asked to connect to their background knowledge. What do you know about this? What are your life experiences? Blah, blah, blah. And then the teacher sets the purpose for the reading. And in this case it is, at the end of this, your group will produce one document that answers these 4 questions about that reading. Now the kid who can write is the kid who writes. The other kids talk and they come to, if you look at the rest of them, they come to consensus around what they think the answer is, and then the kid who is fluent in, the future teacher of America, bless you, is doing the writing. But all kids contribute. So that the teacher utilizes the background step for the group instruction. And so there's been research on how long does it take kids to get used to this. If it's used 2 or 3 times a week, it takes 4 weeks and they got it. They know the steps. And if all teachers use it, if the science teacher and the social studies teacher also uses it as a way to do it, the kids are getting it rehearsed. And then they walk away within a month of, I got that. I know how to do this. I never start anything without being sure I know something about the background. And what's the purpose? Why should I do? How many of our special ed kids are just along for the ride? They don't know what the product is supposed to be because they're scaffolded all along the way. That first step sets the stage. And once you've done it 10 times, it works. So the last couple of things I want to say, here's some websites for you to learn more about it, if you wish. And social emotional learning. I'm on kind of a mission. And my initial training, I have my doctoral degree in school psychology, but then I also went on, I did graduate stuff to get certified as a principal, district administrator, and I've had a long career, right? And the whole social emotional learning thing was causing me some discontent when it first came out. And because it sounded so familiar to me initially. So here's food for thought. This is from CASEL. This is the Social Emotional Learning National Center that talks about the 5 areas of social emotional skills. How many of you have seen this before? How many of you can spell CASEL? There's no T in this one. And then for each of those, there are competencies, right? You're familiar with that? Say yes, even if you're not. Social skills training, we've been doing social skills training for a long time. It's a strategy-based process. You teach 5 steps to kids. Stop and the one I use. Stop and think. Do I want to make a good choice or a bad choice? What are my choices? Strategies. Pick one. Do it. Did it work? The same 5 steps. And I don't care if I'm at a high school, if I've got an issue with somebody in the back, or an elementary school. If they know it, as a teacher, I just go, that's it, because now they prompted the 5 steps. I don't have to say, whoa, 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 what's going on back there? What are you doing? What are you supposed to be doing? I mean, you listen to that. Kids aren't internalizing the steps. You're saying the steps and they're responding to you just to get you out of their face. I want to start the process and then them take it. So with that in mind, and how do you teach? Oh, you show kids? How many of you know Anita Archer? No? Explicit instruction? She's awesome. She has invented or coined the I do, we do, we do, we do. She always does, you do. Okay, that's what this is. That's how you teach kids. That's how you teach adults. But if you go to something like Skill Streaming, Research Press, and you look at the skills in the social skills training stuff that are taught through those 5 steps and embedded into every day, you will find every one of the competencies, every one of the areas of CASEL, and every competency in this instructional approach. There is no difference. It's how you choose to do it. And CASEL has 4 ways that they suggest social emotional learning in schools. Only one of them is explicit instruction. The other 4 are embedding into school climate, that type of stuff. So the last resource I want to give you is the engagement resource. So Kathleen Lane at the University of Kansas has this outstanding guide, Behavior Supports Infused in Instruction. There are 6 behavioral strategies that teachers can use, opportunity to respond. Often teachers will pick on the kids to respond who already know the answers. There's a strong relationship for kids with disabilities between their engagement and their academic improvement if we increase their OTR, their opportunities to respond. May have to scaffold, Mary, I may have to walk up to you and scaffold you, but I want you to become engaged by responding more often, and I have to construct it so you can do that. It's more, responding is a more effective instructional strategy for struggling kids than it is for non-struggling kids. So if you, and the way we do this, and then I'll leave you go, the way we do this is we take, there are 7 of these. We do book study. We do 1 a month in a school. Everybody talks about, what are the strategies for OTR? And it literally is a curriculum guide. And then we do it for a month, get everybody back together, talk about how did it work? Do you think it helped? Blah, blah, blah. And when people are ready to move on, the next month we pick another one, and another one, and another one. And notice what's in here is pre-correction. That's also known as pre-teaching. So these strategies can be placed, and if you are doing these 7 things, you will not have kids off task trying to escape nearly as much as if you don't use them. All of this is Tier 1. Thank you for coming. I hope that this made some sense to you.
Is this going to be on the website?
It is on the website. Yeah, all of this stuff is on the website. Okay? And my email's up there. If you need anything else, email me. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Yeah, what now?